My name is Nancy Hudson. I was the St. Andrews Waterfront Project Director when the City of Panama City purchased the Panama City Publishing Company Museum in 2005. And we got a grant from the state of Florida, Bureau of Historic Preservation, and restored the building and reopened it as a museum in 2007-2008. So George and Lillian West married in 1909, and they built this building in 1920. They started construction in 1918, and there's stories in the St. Andrews Bay News and the Panama City Pilot about this being the first brick building constructed in St. Andrews.
When I sold it to the city, I wanted it to be kept like the old shop, where people could come and see what old-time printing was about and what it liked. They did a fantastic job on bringing the shop up to par, running new electricity, doing a lot of stuff, roof work, everything. And two, the ladies that do the volunteer work here are just super. They come in, it's no pay, it's their own time, and they do a great job.
In 2007, we received a grant from the state of Florida and were able to restore the building. And during that process of pulling up some rotten floorboards, discovered an entire pile of 30 or 40 liquor bottles, mostly gin, some whiskey, that were hidden under the floor. There had been a hole at some point, and during the 1940s or 50s, whoever would have been running the linotype, which is where the hole was close to, would have been drinking and slipping those bottles through the hole in the floor. Miss Lillian was staunchly opposed to liquor, as was Mr. West, and spent much of her time fighting it. And she would have been opposed to her employees drinking on the job. Miss Lillian was very frugal. Of course, she lived through the Depression, and whenever she could find something of any kind of value, she would make use of it. At one point, she actually scavenged some things from some trash piles. There's a mail cabinet in the museum that she had actually pulled off of the trash pile behind the post office, and she used it in her printing area for filing some different things in those little slots, and we use it today. She would save anything scrap, metal, license plates, pieces of tin, even tobacco tins, little pieces of scrap that she would have used. And she patched holes in the floor, in the wood floor of the museum. Whenever there would be a little rotten place or a worn place, she'd just go and tack down a piece of metal or a license plate.
I'm here to talk about Miss Lillian in some of the early days, not that I was there, but I'm going to start in 1908 and introduce you to a remarkable young woman. Her name is Lillian Carlisle. She was 24 years old in 1908, and she had been doing something for about 4 years that was truly remarkable for a woman in that time and place. She was running her family business, extensive family business, land holdings in East Bay County and other interests. It might be familiar to some of you when you hear her grandparents' last name, and that's Callaway, which is a city just to our east. And this young woman is handling all of those things. This young woman has what she thinks is a really unbelievable idea. And it's an idea to open up a canal connecting East Bay County, where her family's interests were, through to the Apalachicola River, bringing trade and other things into the area and increasing the business in that area. Well, what is a 24-year-old girl who can't even vote in 1908 going to do with an idea like that? Well, the first thing she does is come up with a plan to raise the money. and she believes that she can get the different women's groups to help her, and she comes up with a slogan, and it's "Get together, get to work, save the waterway from the speculators." And she writes a big editorial about how she's going to do this, how they can do it, how much it's going to cost. $25,000. What's going to happen? Well, still, what to do with that idea? She thinks about that, and who better to take this idea to than the publisher of the paper in Panama City? And so this 24-year-old woman, armed with her papers, goes to visit the publisher of the newspaper, George Mortimer West. In 1908, Mr. West had been through quite a bit. He was publishing the very first newspaper in Panama City, the Panama City Pilot. He had been through many things, and in the last few years, he had suffered some tragedies. He had lost his first wife. In 1908, that very year, he had lost his second wife. But he's a very busy man running his development company, publishing that paper, doing all the things that he did. He was quite the Renaissance man. And Miss Lillian goes to see Mr. West. And she tells him her idea of doing this canal and how she's going to raise the money and all these things, and asks him to print her editorial in his paper. And he likes her idea, and so he prints this editorial, full-page spread that Lillian has written, and he titles it East Bay Canal, a lady's proposition. Lillian would later say, "I got my canal, and I got my husband." In spite of their almost 40-year age difference, they will begin a relationship. In my mind, I have to think of it as both a mentoring and just a remarkable meeting of two great intellects. Here is a woman that this man recognizes this in, and they start their relationship quite secretly. It does start with letters. I can add that these letters were found after Hurricane Michael in the great-great-grandson's home, which had been Miss Lillian's home. And as the relationship progresses, it gets more romantically involved. And I have a little excerpt from one of Miss Lillian's letters that was found after Hurricane Michael to George. And it says, "Your letter is in my lap, and when my eyes fall on any portion, I see and feel that same true love revealed that I have always wanted and lived in hopes of all my days." As their secret relationship progresses, they will marry in 1909. And they'll do something even more unusual than have this enormous age difference between them. They will become business partners. They will work together, and in 1920, they will complete the building that's now on Beck Avenue that would be the St. Andrews Publishing Company. If you go into the museum and you go into their office, you will see their partner desk where they sat across from each other, their shared spectacles, the 1895 typewriter where George would type the editorials and pass on later to Lillian. Out of that little newspaper, eventually they will produce 3 different newspapers, the Panama City Pilot, the St. Andrew Bay News, and the Lynn Haven Free Press. By 1920, Mr. West was approaching 80, and it was no real secret that Lillian was running much of the business. In 1920, Lillian will do something else. Women got the right to vote, and Lillian is the very first woman registered to vote, we know at least, in St. Andrews. And she had this to say about women voting for the first time. She said, "A drink of shiny, moonshine, or a cigar is not going to produce the results that they have seen heretofore in elections." It was noted that women in 1920 were the very first and the very last at the polls, and everyone was completely flabbergasted that they seemed well versed in the issues. By 1926, things would change for Lillian again. Mr. West would pass away. It was no one's surprise that she becomes the inheritor of all his business interests, including the 3 papers. She was not your stereotypical woman in those days. She was running this business 6 days a week. She didn't really care about fashion or what women were supposed to be like. She wore serviceable dresses, big pockets. Her only concession to adornment was a cameo she always wore on her clothing. She was one that took her job as editor and publisher quite seriously, running those 3 papers. She never signed her name to her editorials. She never used anything but her initials in regards to the business, which was probably pretty common for any woman in those days. Elsie West. She believed her job as editor was to lead the people, to be very honest, to be very fair. She once said, "I believe I'm the most cussed at woman in this town." I'll give you an example of her, some of her editorials. She was very proud of both St. Andrews and Panama City, and as you've heard, she resisted the St. Andrews becoming part of Panama City, but she was very protective of Panama City too. And there's someone in town that goes to Chicago and does some pretty strong anti-Panama City comments. Well, in her editorial, she calls him, and I quote, "a flat-footed, distorted brain, windjammer." But after doing that, she gave him equal time to address his response in her paper. Quite the businesswoman, quite the opinionated person. I will end by giving you a few of her positions as editor of those 3 papers. When she took over the papers, it was a time of prohibition in our country. Miss Lillian was the granddaughter of a Baptist minister, so it's no surprise that in her editorial she strongly supported prohibition. She believed it caused nothing but misery, the use of alcohol. Quite a surprise and a very dangerous thing to do. The 1920s were a time very similar today, really, when there was a big fear of foreigners. In those days, it was the Yellow Peril and the Oriental Exclusion Act. And in the South, in those days, you saw a real rise, once again, of the Ku Klux Klan. Miss Lillian would strongly condemn their actions in her papers, a pretty brave thing to do. My last one I'll give you, in 1928, the very first Catholic, Al Smith, would run for president. Oh my goodness, the world as we knew it would end. The Pope would rule the United States. It was astonishing the things that were said about Al Smith, this fear of someone different. So what's the granddaughter of a Baptist minister going to do in her editorials? I can't use her language, I don't have a copy of them, but basically, Miss Lillian would say, "Stop. That's not fair. Judge him for his policies, not his religion." And I will tell you that in 1928, our country, as well as Florida, went for the Republican Herbert Hoover. Little Obey County went for Al Smith. Miss Lillian really did leave. She would sell the St. Andrew Bay News. She would continue the publishing business. She would work with the great-great-grandson of George, and in the 1970s, she would pass away. A remarkably strong, wonderful woman.
My name is Margaret West Matheson, and I'm the great-great-granddaughter of Lillian C. West. I never knew my grandfather, but we always referred to Miss Lillian as Grandmama. So when I say Grandmama, you know who I'm talking about. I was lucky enough to know her because she was so much younger than Grandpapa when they got married. So I had some pretty good tales about her. I was in my teens when we moved to Panama City, and I was the typical teenage child that loved to go to the beach and dance and party. And Grandmama wasn't that kind of person. She was a a little bit of a staunch, she was Baptist, and she was very, very proper. So one day I walk into Grandmama's house, and I'd been out to the beach, and I had on a pair of hip huggers, which go below the navel, and a crop top. She took one look at me and came over with a safety pin. I swear it was this big. She yanked my hip huggers up and put that pin in them and told me never, ever to go out of the house with that showing again. So, P.S., a few years later, I get to be Miss Panama City. And because of that, the local photographers were photographing me all the time. And one in particular photographer was Bob Hargis for the News Herald. Well, he told me I was going to be in the paper with that bikini on. And I said, I need to know what day it comes out, because I got to go down and steal Grandmama's paper. Because if she sees me in the bikini in the newspaper, I mean, it would have just been, I would have been disowned. But, you know, and I was a normal kid, and here was Grandmama a lot older and very, very strict and very proper. And she was a little intimidating to me. But because of Grandmama's driving, I ended up being her driver. So I was driving Miss Lillian there for a while.
Back then, women were not supposed to have positions like she had. Women supposed to be in the kitchen. Well, a lot of businessmen around town did not like Grandmama because of the editorials she wrote about the roadhouses and about the numbers racket and the bootlegging and all that. She was against it. And a lot of them didn't like it. And one day, she was at the house down at the cabin on Beach Drive, and a bunch of businessmen came to see her. And Grandmama always wore a big print dress. She was a big lady and had 2 pockets in front. And she kept a wallet in one with a rubber band around it. And that day she had a little .22 pistol in her other pocket. And they were trying to tell Grandmama what she was going to do and what she could do and couldn't do. She ran them off with her pistol. And they knew she meant what she said. Another thing with Grandmama, back then, there was a creek running through the backyard. At one time, there was a spring in the middle of what is Baker's Court. Well, the city capped it because they wanted that street. When they capped it, it came out other places. But she had a creek down there, and she had a little widened out place where she had some brim in there. And she was down there one day, and there was about a 3-foot alligator in the creek. So she called what they called game wardens back then. She called them and said, you all need to come down here and get this alligator out of my creek. It's eating my fish. And they said, oh, Miss West, there's not any alligators down there. So she went in the house, got her .22 rifle, went back and shot it. And she called them and she said, come get this dead alligator out of my creek. She pretty well did what she wanted to. But she was a character. And there are many, many stories. And I've known a lot of them and probably forgotten them. When I was teenagers, we came down here, must have been summertime, and Grandmama had a chicken lot behind the house. Not just chicken wire fence, you know, and had a bunch of chickens. And she was in there, and when she was working, she always wore these big old high rubber boots. That was her work boots. And so she dug me some worms and got me a cane pole, took me down to the old dock and let me catch some chauffeurs, which to me at the time was exciting. But there are just numerous tales about her. And there will be other people, I think, you know, probably remember a lot of different tales about her too. I've had people stop me and say, you know, I remember your grandmama. But she was something else.
George West passed away in 1926, and after his death, Lillian continued to be a force to be reckoned with. She continued to run all of his business ventures. on until the 1960s when other West descendants took over the business.
My grandmother, L.C. West, ran the shop after the death of her husband, took over. She was newspaper lady, commercial printing, and she was quite a character. And in her later life, she didn't get any better. She thought she ran the place. Like, she would leave here to go to the post office and walk across the street. If cars were coming, she'd just walk out in front of them and hold up her hand. They had to stop for her.
Most of my family knew Ms. West a lot better than myself because of me being a youngster, but I have a couple of anecdotes about Ms. West. In my early teenage years, I acquired a used bicycle, and it was one that the brakes were not too dependable. But in boogieing down the sidewalk in front of the print shop, I was not aware that Ms. West was fixing to step out. But when she did, I had the decision to make: either run into her or run into the parking meter. And the parking meter won, but she was nice enough to ask if I was okay and was my meter okay. But she was a very nice lady. She was very community-minded. A woman in her position back then generally was a housewife or a school teacher. But one other little anecdote about her that Mr. White mentioned, her car, she bought that somewhere maybe around 1954. But my daddy always said he knew Ms. West to the point that he could talk to her about things, but he also said that he believed she did not have a driver's license. But her car, you could always tell the newer dents because they weren't rusty. And she never had any of them fixed. She just kept driving it, but it was comical. Like I say, one day she would come in front of our house headed to Beach Drive, and then the next day there would be a new shiny spot on there. But there you have it. Do what we can with it. Just go on. Maybe she'll learn to use first gear.
She slept in a hammock. And the reason that she took me in there, because she wanted to hang it from, it was hung from, say like from these two corners of the room. She wanted it hung from these two corners, the other direction. And she slept in that hammock. I says, well, how in the world do you get in that thing? She says, she just turned around and showed me. Just sat down on the edge of it and started pushing with her feet until her feet left the ground. And when they left the ground, she just swung over and pulled her cover up, and that's where she slept.
When I first came in here, I guess it was in the first time I came was 60s, and Grandmama did some printing for the courthouse and for the bank and everything. And like I said, she's a big lady and she didn't walk real fast. And I went to a commercial bank with her one time, and you know, you go in and you want to see the head man, you got to talk to the secretary first and go sit down and wait. Grandma just walk on in. They just say, hey, Miss West. She'd go back and talk to, I guess it's Nelson back there, I'm not sure. Janet Class Chapman. I loved her. She was so sweet. But Grandma would go in there and she'd go past everybody and she said, Gladys, I need some printing work. She wanted a job to do. And she wasn't ugly about it, but she didn't mess around with being asked what she wanted. She'd go in and tell them.
I stole one of Ms. West's goldfish one time. And she found out about it, and I had to take it back. needless to say, I got punished for it, which I deserved. I couldn't deny that at all.
My dad had a restaurant down on Tarpon Dock, Jesse Cook Seafood Grill. It was a little small restaurant. It had about 4 or 5 booths on either side. You walked in narrow with a couple of tables. And in the back was a big case that he kept all of his fresh pies. They made, it was mainly a seafood restaurant, but the pies was a big deal. We had a cook that worked with us, old Louise, for years, and my mother worked there also and made pies. Lemon, meringue, coconut, meringue, chocolate meringue. A few fruit pies, lemon and cherry and apple, but not many of them. Mainly was a meringue pies. And Ms. West was coming up one day. I was there helping in the front and looked, and she drove it. I remember it being a little Henry J. Big hat, sun hat on, filled up that car, you know. She came down the road and got right in front of the restaurant and noticed a parking space, made a U-turn right in the front, bumped the curb, up on it, settled down, come out, opened the car door and got out and came in. I was there, I was a young man, I was there watching what was going on. And she said, I'd like to get one of the pies. I always get the lemon meringue pie, I think it was. And they went back to the back. We kept them, never kept those on the refrigeration back in those days because they would taste better. They would be more realistic. So she got one, come on back up to the front and says, here, I said, $1.50. Oh no, I pay $1.25. Said, they've always been $1.25. Said, no ma'am, they've gone up. Well, said, here, this is it, and put it down on the counter. Said, that's it. Your $1.25, and that's all it's worth, and left through the door. Well, we laughed at Ms. West. She was a sight.
One of my buddies in high school working for a civil engineer, and he says he's looking for another helper. And I says, well, all right, what are we doing? He says, we're walking through the woods and clearing out lines so they can shoot levels and what have you. I said, let's go for it if you say you got me the job. And so we went for it. I told Ms. West, I said, well, Friday will be my last day. And she says, you can't. I said, why can't I leave? She says, I won't let you. I says, well, Ms. West, I already got another job, and Friday, I won't be back because I go to work for this other job on Saturday. And she didn't say anything. Come Friday afternoon, she handed me my little envelope and said, I saw fit to give you a little raise. And I said, thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. And then she said, well, you can't quit. I said, yes, ma'am, I can. I already have. So, but anyhow, when Friday afternoon come, she handed me my little envelope, and she gave me a penny an hour raise. And that was great. Any raise was good. I didn't hand it back to her.
I rode with her one time, and it was terrifying. I wouldn't ever do it again. So most everybody in town, older people, have a story about Grandmama and her driving, because she would, if she come to a red light, she might stop and look both ways. If there was nothing coming, she'd go on. She wasn't a good driver at all. So when people saw Grandmama coming, they usually turn off and go another way.
Court is in session. I mean, they're having a hearing. Grandmama just opens the door, bailiff doesn't bother her, she just walks right down to the bench. And the judge said, well, hello, Miss West. "How are you?" He said, and then he called a recess for the court because he knew better than to argue with Grandmama. So she says, "You can't take my driver's license away." He said, "Oh, yes, we can, Miss West." "Well, I'm going to drive anyway. What are you going to do? Put me in jail?" She put her hands on her hips, and then the judge says, "Miss West, just please don't drive anymore."
When I went to work for the railroad, I was told, see, we was working down around the old beach drive, you know, and Ms. West would come across the track, and they told me one thing about it. Now, when you see Ms. West coming, she's not going to stop. So we'll have to stop and let her by. I says, all right, we will do that.
But one of my friends was a policeman uptown, and I got talking to him one day, and I said, "Robert, do you know Ms. West?" "Oh, goodness, if I see her on the road, I turn around and go the other way." I said, "Don't get tied up with Ms. West." I said, she is something.
I was going around town speaking to the Rotary and I don't know what other clubs. Well, I'd introduced myself, who I was. I was just Margaret West at that point. And somebody in the back would always say, are you kin to Miss West? Miss Lillian? I said, yes, she was my great-great-grandmother. And I could just forget making my talk because after that, everybody had a story about Grandmama's and her driving. But the one on that particular day, this man said, I'll never forget it. My friend and I were standing on Harrison Avenue. It's where that little round corner was. I think there was a Walgreens or something there at the time. And he said, here comes Miss West in second gear. And there were these young boys behind her. And they go up, and Grandmama finally stops at the red light, which was pretty amazing in its own. But these kids just rammed her 3 times. Bump, bump, bump. So Grandmama just put it in reverse. They didn't know that. And when it came time to take off, she went bump, bump, bump. And then she took off down the road. The guy said they just laughed so hard. And then when my sister came down here, this is early on, she was riding the bus from our house to St. Andrews, and the light was green and the bus driver stopped. And she's looking and looking, and here comes Grandmama. They knew to look out for her but she'd gotten a new car. And the bus driver said, you know, they should put that on the news when Miss West gets a new car so we'll all know who to look out for. I mean, and there's just stories of her driving on the other side of the road so she wouldn't get her car wet in a puddle. I mean, she was a really extraordinary person. And I wish I had been not so intimidated by her as a teenager because I could have learned so much from her.
And in my younger days, I'd just heard about Miss Lillian West, but as the 50s rolled on, I began working at Kelly's Supermarket in around 1959, and I experienced Miss West firsthand. She would come in the store from time to time to buy her groceries and whatever, but I would see her walk across the Beck Avenue from the printing company to the post office. She would step off the curb, never look, just walk out into the street. Cars would wait for her, she wouldn't wait for them. And Mrs. West, she didn't have much respect for traffic laws. She just made up her own. Traffic lights and stop signs were an inconvenience. In those days, in the 50s, Beck Avenue was Highway 98. And in the summer, it was extremely busy, bumper to bumper traffic. And she was driving her Willys one afternoon, and she needed to come into Kelly's Supermarket to get something, and she couldn't find a parking place. So she just left the Willys right there in Beck Avenue and tootled across Beck into the store, and traffic is backed up both directions.
and horns blowing, people out of their car screaming, "Who's driving that Willis?" Well, she comes into Kelly's, and the dairy case is on the opposite side of the store, and she's walking towards it. Well, the store manager follows her back there, and he approaches her and says, "Miss West, you can't just leave your car parked in the street. Do you see what you've caused out there?" Her response was, "I've got to get my buttermilk." And she got it. He left her alone, and she walks back to the cashier and checks it out and goes and gets into her Willis, puts it in probably second gear and tries to start off. Clutch just smoking. And that was the one time that I really experienced Mrs. West and her stance in St. Andrew, and she definitely was a fixture in that area.
She knew everything. Yeah. I don't know where she got all the information, but boy, she knew everything. She sure did.